The room was a cathedral of quiet money. Crystal glittered. Silver gleamed under soft, calculated light. The low murmur of conversation was the sound of deals being made, of lives being altered by men in expensive suits. Alastair Rousseau sat at his usual table, the one in the corner with a perfect view of the entire restaurant and no view of him from the street. It was his restaurant. Not on paper, of course. The papers were clean, listing a shell corporation with a respectable board of directors. But the city knew. Everyone who mattered knew that Thorns on the Boulevard was Alastair's place. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, his face a roadmap of hard decisions and harder nights. His suit was Italian, bespoke, the color of a midnight sky. His white shirt was impossibly crisp, a slash of purity against the darkness of his attire and reputation. Across from him, Leo, his most trusted man, sat in silence. Leo was a mirror of his boss's stillness, but where Alastair was calm, Leo was coiled, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, waiting for a threat that would likely never come here. This was sanctuary. Alastair raised a glass of water, the ice clinking softly. He did not drink alcohol when discussing business. And everything, in his world, was business. He observed the flow of the room, the choreography of waiters, the practiced smiles of the patrons. He saw it all not as a scene of leisure, but as a system of moving parts. A machine. His machine. Then he saw her. She was old, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone whose bones ached. Her uniform, the same elegant black worn by the younger staff, seemed to hang on her frail frame. It was a size too large, as if she had shrunk away from the world over time. Her hair was a fine, white mist pulled back into a severe bun. He had never seen her before. Alastair knew his staff. He knew their names, their families, their debts. It was how he maintained control. This woman was an anomaly. A gear out of place in his perfect machine. She held a single bottle of red wine, a vintage he recognized as obscenely expensive. Her hands trembled. Not just a tremor of age, but a deep, resonant shaking that came from the very core of her being. It was fear. Leo noticed his boss's focus shift. He followed Alastair's gaze to the old woman making her slow, unsteady way towards their section. "New," Leo said, his voice a low rumble. Alastair did not reply. He simply watched. The woman approached the table next to theirs, where two loud, fleshy men were celebrating a recent acquisition. They paid her no mind as she fumbled with the corkscrew. Her knuckles were white. The cork came free with a soft pop that was lost in the men's booming laughter. She began to pour. And then it happened. She stumbled, a small, almost imperceptible lurch. A gasp, thin and sharp. The bottle tilted wildly. The wine did not spill on the boisterous men. It did not splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. Instead, in a perfect, impossible arc, the deep crimson liquid flew through the air and landed squarely on the front of Alastair Rousseau's chest. A dark, blossoming flower of red on a field of pure white. Silence. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The murmur of conversation died. The clinking of cutlery stopped. Leo was on his feet in an instant, his hand inside his jacket, his body shielding Alastair. His face was a mask of cold fury. He took a step towards the old woman, who stood frozen, the now empty bottle hanging from her fingers. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to suck all the air from her vicinity. "Don't," a voice said. It was quiet, but it cut through the thick silence like a shard of glass. Alastair had not moved. He had not flinched. He simply raised one hand, a gesture that stopped his formidable lieutenant in his tracks. Leo froze, his loyalty warring with his protective instinct. Alastair's eyes were not on Leo. They were locked on the old woman. He was not angry. He was not surprised. He looked at her with an unnerving, penetrating stillness, an intensity that had made lesser men confess to crimes they had not committed. He was looking for something. And in the depths of her terrified eyes, he was beginning to think he had found it. Alastair Russo was a man built from the wreckage of a life he had been forced to leave behind. He was born in the old country, in a village that smelled of wood smoke and baked bread, a place of simple truths and hard work. He was not Alastair then. He was Alessandro, a boy with eyes full of dreams and hands that knew how to fix engines, not break men. His empire, this sprawling network of fear and favor that held the city in its grip, was not a monument to ambition. It was a fortress. A fortress built to protect the memory of a boy who had lost everything. He had rules. They were the iron pillars that held up his world. Rule 1: never act on emotion. Emotion was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor that others would exploit. Rule 2: information is more valuable than gold or lead. Know everything about your friends, and twice as much about your enemies. Rule 3: betrayal is answered only one way. Swiftly and permanently. And the unwritten, most important rule of all, the one that lived in the silent chambers of his heart: protect the innocent. It was a rule born from failure. From a night 50 years ago, a night of fire and screams, when he had been unable to protect the only innocent person who had ever mattered. Isabella. Her name was a ghost on his lips, a memory so sacred he never spoke it aloud. She was the daughter of the village baker, a girl with laughter in her eyes and flour on her nose. She had seen the good in Alessandro, the boy who dreamed of crossing the ocean and building a life with his hands. They had a secret. A symbol. A swallow, carved into the bark of an old olive tree on the hill overlooking their village. It was their promise. He would go to America, make his way, and send for her. The swallow, he had told her, always finds its way home. He had a matching tattoo etched over his heart, a crude, hand-poked thing done by a traveling sailor. A permanent reminder of his promise. But rival families and old-world feuds had followed him across the ocean. War had broken out in the streets of his new city, and before he could send for her, the violence reached back to the old country. Her village was caught in the crossfire. A message had been sent to the young, ambitious Alessandro. A message written in blood and fire. He learned of her death from a crumpled, tear-stained letter from her mother. The fortress began construction that day. Alessandro died, and Alastair Russo was born. A man who would become so powerful, so feared, that no one would ever be able to touch anyone he cared about again. It was a promise made to a ghost. Now, he looked at this trembling old woman, at the dark red stain spreading across his chest like a fresh wound, and he felt the foundations of his fortress begin to shake. He saw the desperation in her eyes, a desperation that went far beyond spilling wine on a dangerous man. This was not an accident. An accident would have involved apologies, hysterics, a mess on the floor. This was precise. It was an act of surgical despair. He lowered his hand and slowly, deliberately, began to unbutton his ruined shirt. Leo watched, his face a storm of confusion. The boss never showed weakness. He never broke protocol. What was he doing? Alastair ignored him. He ignored the gasps from the surrounding tables. His world had shrunk to the space between him and the old woman. He pulled the shirt open. There, against the pale skin of his chest, was the tattoo. Faded by time, the lines blurred by age, but unmistakable. A single swallow in mid-flight. The old woman's eyes fixed on it. A sound escaped her throat, a choked, broken sob of relief and sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of 50 years. Her face, etched with fear, crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated grief. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks, silent and heavy. She knew. Somehow, she knew. Elena, Alastair said. Her name. He had not known it a moment ago, but seeing her face, seeing the recognition in her eyes, it came to him from a place deeper than memory. Isabella's mother. The baker's wife, who had always slipped him a warm roll when he passed by her shop. The woman who had written him the letter that had ended his world and begun a new one. She nodded, unable to speak, her body racked with silent sobs. Alastair looked past her, his gaze sweeping over the restaurant. He saw the manager, Marcus Thorne, rushing over, his face pale with panic and fury. Thorne was a weasel of a man, all sharp angles and cheap cologne. He had a reputation for squeezing his staff, for skimming profits, for a pettiness that Alistair had always found distasteful but unimportant. Until now. "Mr. Russo, I am so sorry," Thorne began, his voice slick with false deference. "She's new. Senile, I think. I'll fire her immediately. Your meal is on the house, of course. Everything." Alistair raised his hand again, and the manager's voice died in his throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Alistair's eyes were like chips of ice. He turned his gaze from Thorne back to Elena. He saw the worn-out shoes peeking from under her uniform. He saw the faint bruises on her arms, shaped like fingers, barely visible in the dim light. He saw the terror in her eyes as she looked at Marcus Thorne, a terror that was different from her fear of him. It was the fear of the trapped. The fear of the powerless. "Why are you here, Elena?" Alistair asked, his voice soft, for her alone. She flinched, looking at Thorne, who was glaring at her with pure venom. "Tell me," Alistair insisted, his voice gentle but unbreakable. She swallowed hard, her gaze darting between the two men. "My grandson," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He is sick. Very sick. The doctors, the bills." She trailed off, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Mr. Thorne was kind enough to give me a job." The words were right, but the tone was all wrong. It was the practiced speech of a hostage. Alistair understood. Thorne was not just her employer. He was her keeper. He was leveraging her desperation, holding her captive with a low-wage job while her family suffered. The bruises on her arms suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. The spilled wine was not a plea. It was a Hail Mary. A final, desperate gamble on a half-century-old memory. She had come here, gotten this job, hoping to see the boy her daughter had loved. Hoping to see the symbol they had shared. Hoping that the man he had become still had a piece of the boy he had been. The wine stain on his chest was a map. A map leading him back through time, to a promise made under an olive tree. The boy, Alessandro, had made a promise to a girl. The man, Alistair, now had to decide if he would honor a debt to her mother. He looked at Elena, her face a testament to a life of hardship, a life that should have been eased by the success of the boy her daughter had trusted. He looked at the faded swallow over his heart. He thought of Isabella's laughter. And in that moment, for the first time in 50 years, a crack appeared in the fortress. Not a crack of weakness. A crack to let the light in. Alistair buttoned his ruined shirt, covering the tattoo. He was hiding the past again, but for a different reason. Not to bury it, but to protect it. He stood up, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow over the table. He looked at Marcus Thorne, whose face was now a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. "She will not be fired," Alistair said, his voice flat and cold. Thorne opened his mouth to protest, to argue that she was incompetent, a liability. "Go to the kitchen," he said softly. "Wait for me there." She looked at him, her eyes swimming with 1,000 questions, with a fragile, burgeoning hope. She nodded, turned, and walked away, her step seeming just a little bit lighter. Alistair watched her go, then turned his attention back to the room. He looked at Leo, who was still standing, tense and ready. "Leo," Alistair said. His voice was different now. The brief flicker of warmth was gone, replaced by the chillingly calm tone of a man about to wage a war. "Sit." Leo Saturday. Alistair sat down opposite him, the dark stain on his shirt a declaration. "I want to know everything about Marcus Thorne," Alistair said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to know where he sleeps, what he eats, how much debt he's in. I want to know about his vices, his weaknesses, his fears. I want to know every dirty little secret he has." Leo nodded, his eyes sharp. He did not ask why. He did not need to. The boss had given an order. That was enough. "And Leo," Alistair added, picking up his water glass. "Have our lawyers draw up the papers?" "What papers, boss?" Alistair took a slow sip of water, his eyes never leaving Marcus Thorne, who was now trying to pretend everything was normal, directing his staff with a false bravado that was painful to watch. "The papers to buy this restaurant," Alistair said. "I want it done by morning." Leo's eyebrows shot up. This was not business. This was personal. And when the boss made it personal, the consequences were always biblical. "And find out which hospital her grandson is in," Alistair continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Get the name of his doctor. Tell the hospital administrator that all of his bills, past, present, and future, are to be sent to my primary office. They are to be paid in full. Anonymously." Leo simply nodded. He pulled out his phone, his thumbs already a blur across the screen. The machine was in motion. Alistair Rousseau's vast, formidable empire, an engine of quiet violence and intimidation, was being mobilized. Not for territory, not for profit, not for revenge. But to honor a 50-year-old debt to a baker's daughter. To save the mother she had left behind. Alistair leaned back in his chair. The restaurant was still quiet, the air thick with tension. He was a patient man. He could wait. Marcus Thorne's world was about to end. He just didn't know it yet. The hours that followed were a masterclass in silent destruction. Alistair did not move from his table. He ordered a coffee, black, and drank it slowly. To any casual observer, he was simply a man waiting, but Leo, who knew him better than anyone, saw the truth. He was a predator settled in for a long hunt, utterly serene in his own lethality. Leo's phone buzzed and chimed with a quiet, relentless rhythm. Information flowed in like a river. Marcus Thorne was not just a petty tyrant. He was a man drowning. Gambling debts to a rival outfit, the kind that were collected with baseball bats. An over-leveraged portfolio of bad real estate investments. He was using the restaurant's accounts as his personal piggy bank, cooking the books to hide his desperation. And worse. Much worse. Leo's face darkened as he read a particular string of messages. He leaned forward, shielding his phone from view, though no one would have dared to look. "Boss," he murmured. "It's not just the old woman. He has a system. He hires vulnerable people. Immigrants with no papers, single mothers, people with sick family members. He gives them an advance, then creates a debt. He docks their pay for fabricated infractions, broken dishes, customer complaints. The debt grows. They can never leave." Alistair's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not justiciable. It was a form of slavery. It was a violation of the natural order of things, a perversion of strength. Strength was for protection, not predation. That was the code. Thorne had spat on the code. "The bruises on her arms?" Alistair asked, his voice dangerously soft. "He gets rough when they talk about leaving," Leo confirmed, his own voice laced with disgust. "He'd remind them of their obligations." Alistair closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. He pictured Elena's trembling hands, her face a mask of terror. He pictured Isabella's mother being manhandled by this worthless parasite. The quiet anger in his chest solidified into a cold, hard diamond of purpose. "Is the purchase ready?" Alistair asked. "The lawyers found his primary creditor, the rival outfit," Leo reported. "We bought the debt. All of it. For pennies on the dollar. They were happy to be rid of the headache. We also acquired the note on the building itself from the bank. As of 5 minutes ago, you own Marcus Thorne. Lock, stock, and barrel." Alistair nodded slowly. "Get him." Leo made a subtle gesture with his head. Two of Alistair's men, who had been sitting at the bar like ordinary patrons, stood up. They were large men, dressed in simple, dark suits, their movements economical and precise. They approached Marcus Thorne, who was berating a young busboy near the service station. One of the men clapped a hand on Thorne's shoulder. It was not a friendly gesture. It was an anchor. Thorne spun around, his face flushed with indignation. "Who do you think you are?" Get your hands off me. The man said nothing. He simply squeezed. Thorne's face went pale. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a primal fear. He looked past the two men and saw Alastair Russo sitting at his table, watching him. Waiting for him. Thorne's legs seemed to lose their strength. He was half-walked, half-dragged to the table and deposited into the chair opposite Alastair. The two men retreated, taking up positions by the doors, effectively sealing the room. The remaining patrons, sensing the seismic shift in the atmosphere, quickly and quietly asked for their checks. Within minutes, the restaurant was empty, save for Alastair, Leo, their men, and a terrified Marcus Thorne. The staff had vanished into the kitchen, hiding from the coming storm. Thorne sat hunched in his chair, sweating through his expensive shirt. He looked like a cornered rat. "Mr. Russo," he stammered. "I don't understand. If this is about the wine, I can assure you." "It is not about the wine," Alastair said, his voice a low, conversational hum that was more terrifying than any shout. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "We need to talk about your business model, Mr. Thorne." Thorne blinked, confused. My business model?" "Yes," Alastair said. "This restaurant. It is very successful. On the surface. But your margins are thin. You have expenses. Debts." Alastair paused, letting the word hang in the air. "You owe the Carlucci family over $200,000. Your markers are due. You also have a balloon payment on the mortgage for this building, which you were never going to make." Thorne's face went from pale to ghostly white. He was looking at a man who had just read the entire book of his failures aloud. How do you know that?" he whispered. "I know it because as of an hour ago, I own your debt to the Carluccis," Alastair said calmly. "And as of 30 minutes ago, I own the bank that holds your mortgage. Which means, Mr. Thorne, that I own you." The finality in his tone was absolute. Thorne stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. "But this isn't about money," Alastair continued, his voice dropping lower. "This is about respect. It's about honor." He leaned in closer. "You have a woman working here. An old woman. Her name is Elena. Her grandson is sick. She came to you for help, for a job. And you saw an opportunity." Alastair began to list Thorne's transgressions, his voice never rising, but each word landing like a physical blow. "You docked her pay $50 for a broken glass. You charged her $100 for a uniform that costs $20. You fabricated a customer complaint to put her another $200 in your debt. You have been paying her less than a third of her wages, claiming the rest is going to pay off an advance she never asked for." Thorne began to tremble violently. And when she got desperate, Alastair's voice became a razor's edge. "When she asked if she could find a second job, you grabbed her. You put your hands on her." Alastair stood up. He walked around the table until he was standing behind Thorne's chair. He placed his hands on Thorne's shoulders, mimicking the gesture his man had used earlier, but his touch was light, almost gentle. It was infinitely more terrifying. "In my world, Mr. Thorne, there are rules," Alastair said, his voice a murmur directly in Thorne's ear. "We do not harm children. We do not harm women. And we do not prey on the helpless. It is a simple code. It is what separates us from animals." He squeezed, just once. A bolt of pure agony shot through Thorne's shoulders. He cried out, a thin, wretched sound. "You, Mr. Thorne," Alastair said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You are an animal. And you have built your little kingdom on the suffering of good people. You took advantage of a woman who has known more loss than you can possibly imagine. You raised your hand to the mother of a saint." Thorne was sobbing now, incoherent with pain and terror. "Please," he wept. "I'll pay her back. I'll give her anything. Please." "It's too late for that," Alastair said calmly. "You are going to sign some papers. You are going to sign over the deed to this restaurant, free and clear, to a new holding company. You will then be escorted to your apartment, where you will pack a single bag. A car will take you to the bus station. You will be given a one-way ticket to a city so far from here that you will forget what the ocean smells like. You will never come back. You will never contact anyone from this city again. The life you knew is over. Alistair released him. Thorne slumped forward, gasping. And if I refuse, he whispered brokenly. Alistair smiled, but it was a chilling, predatory baring of teeth. Then I will simply collect on your debt. The implication was clear. The Carluches would have just broken his legs. Alistair Russo would be far more thorough. Leo placed a folder and a pen on the table. Thorne, with shaking hands, signed where he was told, his signature a frantic scrawl. When he was done, Alistair's men lifted him to his feet. He won't be bothering anyone ever again, Leo stated, a simple declaration of fact. Alistair nodded. The threat was permanently closed. He stood alone in the center of the vast, empty dining room. The cathedral was silent now. He had cleansed it. He turned and walked towards the kitchen. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the dining room's opulence. It was a world of stainless steel, steam, and the lingering smell of garlic and fear. The staff was huddled in a corner, their faces pale. They saw Alistair enter and they flinched as one. He ignored them. His eyes found Elena. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate, a worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide and questioning. He stopped in front of her. The hardened kitchen staff held their breath. "It's over," Alistair said, his voice quiet. "Mr. Thorne will not be returning." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. A young dishwasher made the sign of the cross. Elena just stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Your grandson," Alistair continued. "What is his name?" "Marco," she whispered. "He is at St. Jude's Children's Hospital. The doctors, they say he needs a special treatment. From Switzerland." Her voice broke. "It costs more than I have ever seen." "The treatment has been approved," Alistair stated simply. "A specialist is being flown in. All costs have been taken care of." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not of sorrow or fear. They were tears of disbelief. "How?" she breathed. "Who?" "An anonymous benefactor," Alistair said, cutting her off gently. "Someone who believes in helping those in need." He then looked around at the other staff members. "As for all of you," he announced, his voice carrying through the kitchen, "your debts to Mr. Thorne have been erased. You will all receive back pay for every dollar that was wrongfully taken from you. From this day forward, this restaurant will be managed properly. You will be treated with respect." He turned back to Elena. "You do not have to work here anymore. You do not have to work anywhere, ever again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple checkbook. He wrote in it, tore out the check, and folded it. He tried to hand it to her. She shook her head, pushing his hand away gently. "No," she said, her voice finding a sliver of its former strength. "I cannot take your money, Alessandro." Hearing his old name from her lips was like a physical blow. It transported him back 50 years, to a sun-drenched village and a baker's shop. "You must," he insisted. "I owe you." "I owe her." "You owe her nothing," Elena said, her gaze firm. "She loved you. That was all. She would not want you to pay for that." She looked down at his stained shirt. "I am sorry about your shirt." Alistair almost laughed. The sound would have been alien in this place, on his lips. "Elena," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had not felt in decades. "You have no idea what you gave me tonight. You gave me back a memory I thought was buried forever. That is worth more than all the money in the world." He took the check and tore it into small pieces. "The arrangements for your grandson are not charity," he said. "They are a gift. From me to her. Please. Allow me this. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw past the fearsome reputation, past the cold eyes and the hard face. She saw the boy her daughter had loved, trapped inside the powerful man. Isabella, she began, her voice a whisper. She always told me there was so much good in you. She said you were a good man, just lost. Are you a good man, Alessandro? It was the question of his life. The question that echoed in the lonely silence of his penthouse apartment at night. He had built an empire on fear. He had broken men, ended lives, bent a city to his will. Good was not a word that applied to him. He met her gaze, and for the first time, he did not hide what was in his own. No, he said, his voice raw with honesty. I am not a good man. I am what I had to become to survive. But tonight, he looked at her, at the face that was so like her daughter's. Tonight, because of you, I remembered what it felt like to be the man she knew. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. She nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement of his truth. Alistair reached into his wallet and pulled out a plain black card. On it was a single phone number, nothing more. This is my private number, he said, pressing it into her hand. If you, or Marco, or anyone in your family ever needs anything, a doctor, a lawyer, a friend, you call this number. Day or night. I will answer. I promise. She closed her small, frail hand around the card, clutching it like a holy relic. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for remembering my Isabella. Alistair simply nodded, the words caught in his throat. He turned and left the kitchen, walking back through the silent dining room, a place he now owned but would likely never set foot in again. Leah was waiting by the door. He held out a new jacket for Alistair to cover his stained shirt. As they walked out into the cool night air, Leo spoke. That was complicated, boss. Alistair looked up at the moon, a pale sliver in the dark sky. No, Leo, he said. It was the simplest thing I've done in 50 years. 5 years passed. The city moved on, its memory short, its appetites constant. Thorns on the Boulevard was renamed Elena's, a quiet, elegant place known for its good food and the kindness of its owner, a young man who had taken over management from his grandmother. The young man's name was Marco. He was tall and healthy, his eyes bright with a future he was never supposed to have. He had a degree in business, paid for by an anonymous scholarship that had appeared out of nowhere. He knew the stories. He knew of the quiet, powerful man who had appeared one night and changed everything. His grandmother, Elena, lived in a small, comfortable house by the sea, the one she had always dreamed of. She spent her days gardening and painting, her hands no longer trembling. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, she would tell Marco stories about a girl named Isabella, and a boy named Alessandro, and a promise made under an olive tree a lifetime ago. Far away, in a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, Alistair Russo sat in his office. The room was a monument to power. Maps of the city with his territories marked in red. Ledgers detailing enterprises both legal and deeply illegal. A phone that could summon an army with a single call. It was the fortress, in its final, impregnable form. But on his vast, polished desk, among the artifacts of his dangerous life, sat two small items that did not belong. One was an old, faded photograph in a simple silver frame. It was a picture of a young woman with laughing eyes and a dusting of what might have been flour on her nose. Isabella. Next to it, resting on a small velvet cloth, was a single, perfectly preserved, pressed flower. A small, blue swallowwort, shaped exactly like the bird in its name. Elena had sent it to him a year after that night, with a simple, unsigned note that read, "They always find their way home." He would sometimes look at it in the dead of night, this small, fragile thing, and remember the weight of it in his hand. He had never returned to the restaurant. He had never seen Elena or Marco again. His promise was kept from a distance, an invisible shield around their lives. He remained a ghost, a benefactor known only by the good he had done. For a man's true character is not defined by the world he operates in, but by the choices he makes within it. It is not the ruthlessness he shows his enemies, but the tenderness he shows the vulnerable. In a life built on shadows and fear, one single act of redemptive kindness, one memory of a lost love, can become the only compass that matters. It proves that even in the heart of the most feared man, a small piece of the good boy he once was can survive, waiting for the chance to finally come home.